Yeah, messieurs. Welcome back to the Morph Spearfishing channel. For those who don't know me, my name is Morph, and for as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around fishing undersea. In 2023, I had to take a break from diving for my education, and in February of 2024, I was back at it for a couple of months. In those couple months, I had shot my first permit, my first AP, and my first king mackerel, meaning I ticked every fish off my bucket list, except for the Cubera Snapper. They are one of the largest snapper species in the world, and I had only seen a couple of them underwater, and I had never heard of someone shooting one here in St. Lucia. However, on the Sunday of my last week of diving, my good partner Bendo shot this monster 40-pounder. I called him as soon as I found out on the Monday morning, and before I went out on the water, I told him I was going to shoot one of my own that day. Me and Jamil went over to the Atlantic side with Make It Happen, and as soon as we hopped in the water, I had seen a really nice black grouper run underneath a hole. Unfortunately, that fish had gone too deep into the hole, so I took out my head to see if it would come out the next side. It wasn't the grouper I saw, but there was no way I was going to pass up on such a big Schoolmaster. This fish came in at 3 pounds, which is incredibly common to see on this side of the island. Of course, like always, I brained and bled the fish to preserve the eating qualities, and I put it on my carrier for me to look for some more fish. However, I didn't have to look very far because this nice barra swam right up to me to see what I was doing. That was one of the nastiest stone shots I've ever hit. The Atlantic side is known to have some really nice fish, and with that barra and Schoolmaster, I knew this was going to be a ridiculously good day. We continued drifting down the reef, and I was just swimming around looking for areas I thought would hold fish. The terrain here on the Atlantic is insane since it's full of these crazy ledges and caves, which are the perfect hiding spots for big snappers and groupers. These big craters in the reef are also a perfect place to hold fish, and I didn't waste any time taking out this nice Black Margate. These are one of the bigger members of the grunt family, and in normal circumstances, this 2-pounder would have been a really nice one. However, here on the Atlantic side, this is still below average. Now, as you all can see, I was diving in relatively shallow water around 20 to 30 feet, so I really wasn't expecting to see anything big. However, while I was dealing with the Black Margate, I saw something massive cruising below me. That was a solid king mackerel around the 20-pound mark, and all I could really do in that situation was laugh. Those are a relatively rare fish here in St. Lucia, and seeing that one in such shallow water really changed my perspective on how I was diving. From that point on, I was diving a lot slower, and I made sure that on every single drop I took my time on the bottom. This big Black Margate came cruising down the reef to check me out, but I really didn't want to make that same mistake twice. I could tell it was a really nice fish, so I made sure that nothing else was around before I even considered shooting it. Unfortunately for that fish, it was the only thing in this area. This 4-pounder was a much better size for the Atlantic coast, and it was the last fish I took before we made it to a spot that I will never forget. As soon as we reset our drift, Black Margates were running around the reef like ants, and Make It Happen was blasting fish from the start. However, because of the king I saw earlier, I held off, and by the time everyone had moved by the mark, there was some monster dog snappers coming out of the reef. Doggies are incredibly curious, so I made my drop to land hidden from the cave, so if they wanted to see what I was doing, they would have to come out and give me a shot. At this point, I was expecting to see the fish already, but for some reason they were acting really strange and staying hidden. Then, while I was lying on the bottom, the sea pulled back this fan to reveal a monstrous fish, and I knew that it could only be one thing. A giant Cubera Snapper. I just treated it like any other fish, and I pretended like it wasn't there so it wouldn't see me as a threat. After a long wait on the bottom, it was starting to come closer, and I saw its tail go behind the sponge. However, it ended up making a 180, and with my breath hold ending, I knew that this was my only chance. My line went slack, meaning the fish had escaped. Just the force of the fish running for the hole was enough to bend up my spear and break off my flopper. Under normal circumstances, I would have been absolutely heartbroken, but for some reason in that moment, I was just locked in and I straightened my spear to reload my gun. I looked underneath every side of that rock and into every cave, but it was looking like I had lost that fish for good. However, the last place I had to check was the cave that all the doggies were coming out of, and when I looked under, I saw a massive shadow hanging in that cave. This time the spear went completely through the fish and it was lodged in the rocks, so I knew that this fish was mine.
Boy! Come! Oi, get the next one!
I just kept applying pressure so it couldn't get deeper, and I waited for the boat to bring back up.
Oi! Oi! Bring them on! Come! Get the next man! About a 50-pound Cubera!
However, that took a little time, and while I was waiting on the surface, I felt the tension on my line start to drop. I didn't know what to think of it at first, but then I saw it drifting out of the cave and I went down to make sure that it was finished. I knew that it was big when I shot it, but when I finally got my hands on that fish, I was able to fully understand how monstrous it was. Then, all my excitement was followed by the realization that I had just shot the fish I was hunting for my entire life.
Yes! I'm so happy.
The weight of landing that fish, knowing that it was one of my last times doing the thing that I love the most, was a feeling that I will never forget. Of course, I wasn't going to let the other fellas on the boat see me crying like that, so I locked in and retrieved the fish before they got to me. That absolute monster was and still is the biggest fish I have ever caught, coming in at a massive 38 pounds. Also, the fact that Bendo got his Cubera the day before, as well as the timing of when I got mine, made it the most special fish that I've ever caught.
Boy, that looks
Now, even though I had my Cubera on the boat and my spare was completely destroyed, the day wasn't over. Make It Happen still wanted to stay in the water, and of course, I had no objections. He gave me his backup spare to use, but since I had already shot my cub, I was just throwing my flasher around to see if I could attract anything. The current on the Atlantic side is insanely strong, so I really had to force to try and reach by this rock. Then, as I was pulling up to the bottom, I saw this nice barra and I pretended not to see it until I was able to get closer. When you're dealing with barras, you always want to get control of the head as fast as possible, which means pushing your hands right in their gills. Then you have to dispatch them as quickly as possible so they won't be able to bite you and so they don't suffer. As we continued drifting, I made it to another one of those craters in the reef, and this one was absolutely loaded with fish. There was all kinds of different fish to shoot here, but there were some monster Schoolmasters around, which is what I really wanted to take. Like I said before, big Schoolmasters are quite common on this side of the island, and this 4-pounder was a perfect example of that. Also, as you can see by the lighting, it was starting to get late, and this was the last fish of that unforgettable day.